Welcome to Revelation Unraveled. I'm your host, William Tapley, also known as the third eagle of the apocalypse and the co-prophet of the end times. Today I want to continue our discussion of Daniel chapter 11, which is an end times chapter. This is part 2 in that series. Daniel divided up the 45 verses of chapter 11 into 3 different sections. The first section of 12 verses he divided up into a 4-4-4 sequence. The first 4 verses, the next 4, and the last 4. The next 18 verses he divided up into a 6-6-6 pattern. Verses 13 through 18, 19 through 24, and 25 through 30. The last 15 verses he divided up into a 5-5-5 sequence. The reason for this numerology is to help us to understand who the last king of the north is and the last king of the south. This numerology is very important. There are 6 ancient kings described by Daniel, plus 6 kings of the north and 6 kings of the south, for an evil number 666. The number which defeats 666 is the rosary number 555. We find those same 2 sequences in the Olivet Discourse. The tribulation verses are divided into a 6-6-6 pattern, and the 15 victory verses are divided into a 5-5-5 pattern. Daniel breaks up the last 15 verses into a 5-5-5 pattern to separate the 3 personages he is talking about. In verses 31 through 35, he is talking about Antiochus Epiphanes, who is not the last king of the south. In verses 36 through 40, he talks about the last king of the north and the last king of the south, which has to do with our own times, the times we are living in today. In the last 5 verses, 41 through 45, Daniel writes about the Antichrist. Let's take a look at the king of the north, who I believe is the premier of Russia, and the king of the south, who I believe is the president of the United States. Let's take a closer look at the 5 verses which describe the king of the north, the premier of Russia, and the king of the south, the president of the United States. In verse 36, Daniel writes, "And the king shall do according to his will, and he shall be lifted up, and shall magnify himself against every god, and he shall speak great things against the God of gods, and shall prosper till the wrath be accomplished." This is, of course, a typical communist viewpoint. The communist philosophy is one of atheism. Certainly, the Russian premier would fill this bill. In verse 37, "And he shall make no account of the God of his fathers." In other words, he abandons the Russian Orthodox faith. "And he shall follow the lust of women." Now this is interesting because this is the Douay-Rheims translation. The King James Version says just the opposite. "He shall not regard women." I'm not sure which is correct, but it's obvious, according to Daniel, that this last king of the north, the premier of Russia, has some kind of disconnect with women. In verse 38, we have a very telling description of the Russian premier. "He shall worship the god Maozim in his place." Instead of the god of the Russian Orthodox, he worships the god Maozim. Now, the translation in the Douay-Rheims leaves the word Maozim rather than translating it as fortress as in the King James Version. This is better because it's a proper name, and the translators wisely left it as in the original language, Maozim. And that's because Maozim has significance for these end times. Maozim refers to Muslim, and the God that he worships is the Muslim God. That doesn't mean that the Premier of Russia will be a Muslim, but that he will support the Muslim cause. The Gog-Magog coalition in both Daniel and Revelation is a coalition of Russia and the Muslim nations. And he worships a God whom his father knew not. I believe that this refers to nuclear power. And he shall worship with gold and silver and precious stones and things of great price. The Russian premier will spend a great deal of money developing nuclear weapons. And he shall do this to fortify Muslim with a strange god. Nuclear power is a strange god, and he uses the nuclear power to strengthen the Muslims. We see that happening today in Iran. And he shall increase glory, and shall give them power over many, and shall divide the land gratis. Following World War III, the Russian premier will put Muslims in charge of many countries, including the United States. Verse 40, and at the time prefixed, the king of the south shall push against him. Here I use the translation push, which is out of the King James, because that's better than the Douay Rheims, which simply says fight. What this means is that the king of the south, that is the president of the United States, shall provoke or push against the king of the north. And the king of the north, that is the premier of Russia, shall come against him, that is the king of the south, like a tempest, with chariots and with horsemen, and with a great navy. And he shall enter into the countries. The countries Daniel is referring to here are the countries of England and America, and shall destroy and pass through. This word tempest is very similar to the word Daniel uses in chapter 7, when he describes the goat, which is also a symbol of Russia, attacking the ram, which is a symbol of England and the United States. The ram is crushed by the goat in World War III. This whole passage is very significant because it has to do with the critical times that we are living in today. Now you might say, how can the king of the south be the president of the United States? Certainly the king of the north could be from Russia, because Moscow is due north of Jerusalem. Well, it's interesting, if you look on a map, you'll see that there is a country due south of Jerusalem, and that country is Kenya. And we are considering for president, even today, a man whose forebears came from Kenya. Could Obama be the next and last king of the South? The king of the South who will lose World War III to the de facto premier of Russia, namely Vladimir Putin. I believe that is the scenario that we are looking at today. I believe that Russia is supporting the Muslims with nuclear power, and this will precipitate World War III because the king of the South, the president of the United States, who I believe will be Barack Obama, will provoke the king of the North, Vladimir Putin, into starting World War III, which will cause the destruction of both countries. And those are the three horns which the Antichrist brings down, as in chapter 7 of Daniel. The one horn on the goat, symbolizing Russia, the two horns on the ram, symbolizing England and the United States. In part 3, in our conclusion of our analysis of Daniel chapter 11, we will look at the last 5 verses of chapter 11, which describes the Antichrist, which describes the 3 groups of people who survive the Antichrist, and the 3 nations which will be defeated by the Antichrist, except that those 3 nations symbolize all the nations of the world. Now, if you would like more information, simply write to the address you see on your screen.